Thank you for joining me. For most of you, I think it's morning. So good morning, good afternoon. My name is Awyn Dawn, and this is how to combine recovery and paganism. Um, Little bit of my backstory. I used to I used to take a program on paganism into the jails and prisons. I am the author of now 3 books because I officially sent my third one to my editor. So, Paganism for Prisoners, Paganism on Parole, and I've got a nice little article in the 2024 Witches Companion on the sober pagan. So, yeah, let's get into it then. Just a little caveat. I will be taking questions at the end. So if you've got any good ones, feel free to drop those in the chat. I am coming to you from London. So yeah, I mentioned my books. I do have a background working in mental health. For a while, I was training to be a drug abuse addiction counselor. I've got an undergrad in integrative healthcare. I've written articles for The View, Spirituality and Health. And recovery is something I'm passionate about because it's no secret, I am a pagan in recovery. And what I found is there's some unique challenges, right? So I want to start off with a caveat that this is not going to be a half hour on how to stay sober. If I could do that in a half hour, I would give it to the world. Like anybody who needed it would have it. So what I am going to be talking about though is some specific challenges and how to navigate those. So if you are sober and you're a pagan, you can kind of merge these two things. So I find that there's a fluidity in the pagan faiths that allows it to be very adaptable to our needs. But there are some challenges, like I mentioned, and some of the challenges, there's 4 specifically that I'm going to talk about. Altered states of consciousness, powerlessness, a higher power, and prayer and meditation. So a lot of my own recovery is 12-step based. I know that's not the only way to get recovery. Some people go to mental health counselors, they go to addiction counselors, treatment centers. There's lots of different ways, but this is what worked for me. So it's going to be where my focus is. So the first thing I want to talk about is altered states of consciousness, because one of the things that I found when I was new to recovery is, how am I going to reach all these meditative states? How am I going to raise a cone of power? There tends to be emphasis on things like using marijuana or ayahuasca or alcohol in order to reach altered states of consciousness and connect to the gods and goddesses. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. For most people, that's completely fine. I'm not disparaging that at all. But for me, and if you have substance abuse or alcohol issues like I do, then you need to find another way. So early on, one of the things that I started doing was focusing on the other ways you can induce an altered state of consciousness. And they're not hard. Some of the simplest ones are drumming. Any repetitive motion over a long period of time can help you get into that other state of mind. And so that was a big one for me. And I really appreciate drumming, because with drumming you don't need like a giant drum set, right? I just demonstrated you can use your hands, you can clap, you can get a little hand drum, you can use your legs, you can stomp your feet, and it has that same kind of effect as drumming. And if you don't want to drum yourself, there are so many good resources online for music that's just just drumming, or or just chanting in the background, and you can really focus on these, and they can bring you to a state where you're in an altered state of consciousness, because an altered state of consciousness does not mean you are blitzed out of your mind. That's not what it means. That is not what it should mean in a spiritual context. In a spiritual context, it just means that, like, if here's where your conscious mind is, you just shift just a little bit. So that's one of the ways I started doing that. Another one was through breathing. Breathing is so important. Like, just, but let's all, because I don't know about you guys, but I need a breath. Let's all take a breath together. So breathing. Okay, so when we breathe, we are bringing in an exchange of oxygen with the chemicals in our brain. One of the reasons that, like, crying feels so good is because it releases chemicals that are stored in our brain. So when we take in these deep breaths, we are kind of like getting all these chemicals in our brain to kind of, filter around, and this helps bring about an altered state of consciousness. Somebody in the chat mentioned singing bowls, and absolutely, singing bowls are amazing ways to bring about an altered state of consciousness. So, yeah. So now that we've talked about some sober ways, chanting, meditation, drumming, singing bowls, these are certainly not the only ways. We'll talk about more when I talk about meditation, but these are just a few of the ways that you can alter your consciousness while still being sober. Um, so another one I want to talk about is powerlessness, right? Because hold on a second. I can do spells, right? So doesn't that make me this powerful, this powerful being who can do things and change the world? And back when I was new to magic, I used to think that magic was like the practical magic, that you saw, and you just like, if you focused hard enough, you could make things physically change and evaporate. And um, actually, magic is much more powerful in a different way, because what we can do is we can initiate change within ourselves. And even if we could, turn, copper into gold, even if we could do that, like, change within ourselves is still so much more powerful and potent. Um, so spells can be a useful tool. I just submitted a book to my editor. So it's going to be coming out a year and a half from now, but it's full of spells and rituals and meditations to help um, shape and remake and bring out your best. Um, yeah, it's spells, rituals, and meditations for empowerment. That's the word I was looking for. So it's all about empowering yourself, and different ways that you can do that. You also need to recognize that, magic is this innate thing, right? It's not this external force. So for me, when I was thinking about powerlessness, one of the things that I really had to recognize is that it wasn't the same thing as being helpless. You know, I think we tend to mix them up a lot of times, but they're not the same thing. And speaking from a recovery standpoint, I do know that if I drink, or that if I start getting high, or if, I do compulsive behaviors or anything like that, it's going to spiral, and it's going to lead to more. And that spiral, that sacred shape in magic, like everything else, it has a positive aspect and it has a not positive aspect. And so the spiraling inward, um, and getting like almost tunnel vision, that's how the powerlessness kind of came out for me in my early recovery. And so when I started acknowledging that, that's kind of when I was able to recognize, that I'm not the super powerful being that I wish I was, and luckily I don't wish I was anymore. Because if I had that much power, yeah, I think I would get bored. So, all right, let's talk about the gods for a minute. So the gods and goddesses, the divine spirits, ancestors of place, Alfar, whatever you would like to call them, these energies. that exist. So, this should be one of the easiest aspects of recovery, but it actually provides challenges if you get too stagnant about what it means. And so, what I mean by that is, like, I'm going to go into my personal view. You can use parts of it, use none of it, use some of it, whatever you would like. But for me, the gods are part of this energetic force, right? And I talk about this in my books. There's this energetic force, these strings that we pull, this energy that we get. And so early on, when I was early in recovery, I worked a lot with Danu. She had this mothering energy, this soft, caring, hold you close, tuck you in at night kind of energy that I needed. And for a while that was my higher power definition. And then, I needed to get stuff done, and I started working with the Morrigan energy, and the Morrigan is very much about, like, you're going to face your stuff. You're going to do that. And what I found is, while I was going through early recovery, and still to this day, that I find that the deity that I need, the energy that I need, always shows up. And I actually found a new goddess. Well, she's not a new god. She's new to me because I didn't know about her before, but her name is Sophrosyne. She's a Greek goddess, and she's the goddess of self-control and moderation. So she's actually a good goddess to work with. Um, if you're in recovery and you need that higher power energy. Um, and then oh, and you can work with any deity you want when you're in recovery. I would just challenge you, though, like, if you're working with certain gods like Dionysus, for example, I would challenge you, like, why are you choosing that specific god? Yeah, I will remind me at the end, and I will drop her name in the chat for you. Um, if you're working with a god like Dionysus, um, then you can, like, there's two sides to every coin, right? So even though Dionysus is this, lustful drinking god, there's also that contained other aspect. The important thing is just to know, like, why is that the one that you're working with? What are you hoping to gain? Um, oh, and the fourth part of this section, prayer and meditation. Right. I think this is one of the aspects where, if you're pagan or Wiccan or witch, or any of the terms that fall under the pagan umbrella, I think this is one of those areas where we tend to be a little bit more open-minded to the meditation part than the prayer part. Um, but for me, spells are how I pray. I don't just do spells that are like, okay, please give me this and let me have this and then maybe a pony too. Like, they don't come out like that. The spells that I do more often than not are spells of gratitude. I don't really have a lot to ask for anymore. So a lot of times it's about giving thanks. Spells for this will be in my new book. But there's giving thanks, there's honoring the divine, there's that sacredness of being in nature, of walking in parks, around trees, of putting your hands in the earth. Um, all these are ways that, like, that idea of prayer can be, like, transmuted into something that doesn't feel so canonized, something that doesn't feel so off-putting to a lot of people. And still to this day, that's how I do my prayers. When I do prayers, it's dreams, and it's meditations, and it's lighting candles, and it's chanting, and it's all these things. And more often than not, it's communicating with the gods and goddesses, like a conversation with the goddess about, asking for wisdom. So so I've kind of talked about some of the challenges. um yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, religious trauma is and that's something I had too, because raised Southern Baptist. Um, oh, thank you, Gil. Gil dropped the name Sosphosine in the chat. For those of you who will be watching later, it's Sophrosyne. But yeah, no, I was raised Southern Baptist, so I completely get the religious trauma aspect, and that's one of the reasons why I shied away from recovery for so long. So let's talk about some of the practical bits. Um, so some of the practical bits, you may find yourself, especially if you're solitary or you're looking for a new group, you may find yourself going into a working space and them not having an alcohol-free alternative. It happens. It's happened to me. And it's perfectly acceptable to, pull whoever's hosting the ritual, high priest, high priestess, one of the people who's helping format that ritual, like, hey, I don't drink, is there an alternative available? It's perfectly acceptable to do that. For those of you who aren't in recovery, who maybe host circles, I would encourage you to have, like, even if it's apple juice or orange juice, something you would give to your kids, just to have some of that available. And if somebody does ask for an alternative, to not ask why. That's going to lead me to my next point, because not everybody, like, asking somebody, working up the courage to ask for there to be an alcohol-free alternative. It takes a lot of courage, especially if you're new, you're still kind of figuring it out. And when I was early in recovery, I did have some people, like, why don't you want to drink? Like, what's going on? It seems to be like this burning question. Nobody asks why you don't want to do hard drugs, but everybody wants to know why you don't drink, why you don't smoke weed, and it's really nobody's business, so it's perfectly acceptable to just say, I would prefer an alternative. Um, and you can even offer to bring it if you happen to be in contact with the people hosting the circle, especially if it's a public one. If you happen to be in contact with them beforehand, you can definitely reach out and be like, hey, if you're not offering an alternative, I know I need an alternative, can I bring one? Is there one that I could bring? And you never know who's going to be so happy that that's there and that they don't have to be the one to go and ask. So when I host circles, I always request that there be an alternative available, even if it wasn't for me. Even if I could drink, I would still want there to be an alternative available, because you know, there's always likely to be somebody who doesn't. Maybe they're embarrassed, maybe they're going through legal problems. Maybe, they haven't, figured out what it means. Maybe there's a billion reasons. There's so many reasons. And so in the society we live in, it's just good practice to have those options available. Let's see. Oh, got so many notes here. I've also found that, one of the reasons I talk about recovery so much is because nobody was talking about it when I first came to recovery. No pagans were, anyway. Like, other people were. But since I've been in recovery, like, people be like, oh my gosh, you're a pagan. I thought I was the only one in recovery. And there's a lot of us. Um, and and that's why I encourage talking about it. If you're comfortable bringing up the reasons why, that's a personal choice. If you're not comfortable bringing up the reasons why, that's also a personal choice. But the last thing I want to talk about, I'm only going to talk about for another 5 minutes or so, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. So get your questions ready. Some of the values that that we tend to value in recovery are things that fit well with pagan spirituality. Things like hope and patience and humility. And so three I want to talk about. One is courage. Like, walking a pagan path, it takes courage. When I first started, I don't know how many of you guys can relate to this, but when I first started off, for me, like, it was very much about wearing black and the jewelry and, like, blessed be to you, blessed be to you, blessed be to you, and there was just this very um surface level that happened with it. And um so it took courage for me to step out of that, and for me to, like, really, undergo initiation and second degree initiation, and to really devote my life to this path. And it takes courage, and it takes discipline. There's My high priestess used to say, if you want to keep your witchy power, you keep the Sabbats and you keep the SBATs. And that's some of the discipline, this keeping Sabbats and keeping moons, and not just paying lip service to our faith. So, and there's also integrity. I think this is a big one, and it's not one that we talk about a lot. Um, so, what do we do when no one is watching? Do you recycle only when your friends are watching? Do you, like, throw your bottle on the ground the rest of the time? Or do you do the right thing because it's the right thing? And so, these values, integrity, discipline, courage, some of the others, acceptance and hope and faith and patience and humility. Like, these are values that fit really well within paganism. We should be good people. We should be accepting people. We should have hope. We should have faith and patience and humility. But also, it's okay to, like, brag a little bit. Um, so, these are some of the things, that I've had to spend a lot of time thinking about in recovery. And so now, we're at about 22 minutes, I think. I'm hoping you guys have questions to, like, fill up the rest of the time. If not, I could keep talking about recovery all day. So if you don't have questions, don't worry, I will fill the time. But if you have questions, yes, yes, yeah. I think we all have times when we're definitely slacking. Like, right now, I'm in grad school. So I haven't been keeping up with the Sabbats and SBATs like I should be, you know, um, but we do what we can do. So let's see. Are there any questions in here? Oh, and a new one. Uh, Somebody dropped in the chat, the grad school is tough. Yes, but it's very rewarding too. Um, and it's a whole new world. Okay, so somebody dropped in the chat, I use marijuana heavily. Any tips on slowing that down? It is prescribed, but I feel like it's become a crutch. Okay, so there are certain things that you can do. And for a long time, I used alcohol and weed because, like, they had this feeling of being okay. Because I'm from a state where it's legal, and there's dispensaries everywhere. I think you hit on something very important, though. You feel like it's becoming a crutch, and I think, like, recognition is the first step in that. Like, if you're thinking that it's a problem and it's a crutch, then it probably is. Some of the things you can do is you can taper off. Some people have had good luck with hypnosis. There's also, there's other herbs, like, maybe instead of smoking marijuana, start grinding your own herbs, and instead of smoking them, you put them on your charcoal disc in your cauldron, and you let the smoke fill the room, and you spend that time in meditation. Um, so it's I wish I had just, like, oh, just say this chant and in 30 days you'll be cured. Um, I really wish I could do that. But what I can tell you is to be patient with yourself, to wean yourself off a little bit. And, like, for me, I had somebody come to my house and they helped me get rid of all my pipes and, all my bottles of alcohol and, all my bags of weed and all that stuff. And, like, I got rid of it. And that was a huge step for me because once it was there, I had to like go through the process again. Like, okay, do I want to get my shoes on and get in my car and drive to the dispensary and then go in and pick what I want and then come home? And it just became a lot more work. So I hope that's helpful for you. Let's see, there were some other questions. What is my favorite chapter in your book? In my first one, in Paganism for Prisoners, it's where I talk about death, because that strikes prisoners really hard. I suffered a loss. I don't know if I mentioned this. It says it in my book. I am previously incarcerated, which is another reason why recovery was such a big deal for me. And then in my Paganism on Parole, I'd say mental health. The mental health chapter is my favorite, because I don't think we talk about mental health enough. Let's see, what else do we got? The oh, there's so many good messages in here. Okay. How did I get into a good system? I did somebody wrote recovery help was difficult to find. How did you get into a good system? I tried a lot of the A's. I mean, I know people have reservations because they say the word God and everything, but it's what worked for me. And there's a lot of them. There are so many, like, yeah, overeating and gambling and, substance specific and marijuana specific and alcohol. Like, there's so many of them, so if one doesn't kind of feel the same, then try a different one. Do you find that your recovery molds your pagan path and or vice versa? Oh, absolutely. Um, like that, they're so intertwined. I don't think I could separate like either the pagan aspect of myself or the recovery aspect out of myself. I don't think I could pull either of them out and like just have them individually. I think that's why it comes out in my book so often, because it's really hard for me to talk about one without the other. Because, working, having a purpose, writing books that I at least hope are helpful to people. Having that purpose has really been so helpful. And, when I go to meetings, I feel more comfortable, when it comes up in conversation, like telling people I'm pagan in recovery. And I usually find, like, more often than not, that I'm not the only one or that people have questions, especially since I live in England now. At like, like, oh, there's a lot of pagan roots here. So people tend to be fascinated by it. Um, see. Okay, here's a question. I learned that many people in recovery crave sugar intensely. Do you have any suggestions for using the magic of food to nourish people in recovery? Oh, that is an excellent question. So I mentioned my undergrad is in integrative healthcare, and it's a lot of fancy words for basically where allopathic and holistic medicine meet. And so a lot of those same tapering off. If you crave sugar, try not to make it white refined sugar. Try to get like fruit sugar, not the sweetened bags of gummies sugar, but like, you can put strawberries in the oven and cook them. There's like a recipe you can find and they taste just like Twizzlers, so finding these alternative things. Also water. Oddly enough, our bodies are set up to process anything that's not water as food. So if you're drinking soda, your body thinks it's food. If you're drinking, flavored waters, your body thinks it's food. Your body thinks everything that is not water is food and will digest it as its food. So, this is something to keep in mind. So, I know there are a lot of good books Llewellyn has on like cooking with foods and like the magic of food. I'm not a big cook, but I can tell you that I used to drink like gallons of soda, and I just weaned myself off over time. Um, it was difficult. I'm not going to lie to you guys and be like, oh my God, it's super easy to be in recovery and to break, all these addictions to sugar and other things. Like, Yeah, I wish it was easy, but it does take work. Like, I'm gonna be honest with that. Let's see. We've got a couple more things in here. Ooh, yeah. Ooh, if somebody makes that cookbook, I will buy that. Um, let's see. Somebody wrote, "There's so much energy work, layers and layers to heal. Even if you slip, be kind to yourself. Know you're working on healing. Keep at it. And when you feel alone, connect with others that make you feel loved, safe, secure, and connected." Absolutely. There's an amazing TED Talk. I don't know if I'm allowed to plug TED Talks on here, but I'm going to. Don't remember the name, but if you look up the opposite of addiction is connection, wonderful TED Talk, and it talks about how if we're connected to people, um, if we have that support system, then it's easier to overcome things like addiction and mental health. Like isolation is so dangerous for human beings, and it was mentioned in the chat by somebody earlier that people who use substances, there tends to be you know underlying layers of trauma, adult trauma, and um, addiction is a disease of isolation. Yes, there tends to be these underlying layers. So peeling these layers takes time. It's not an overnight thing, but the work, right? The work is what makes it so worth doing. Like, if somebody just gave it to us, we wouldn't appreciate it. If there was a pill that cured addiction, we would try to take 5 of them. It's just that's how it would go. So it's really that work that makes it worth it. Let's see. Are there any other questions? I am conscious of the time, but I do have time for one more. Oh, I put it in the chat earlier. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter. I'm also on Facebook, but not as much. At Awyn. Any magical tips on overcoming mental desires for while trying to detox? Meditation, breathing, like being in self is so important. And knowing, like, number one tip, it's okay to be uncomfortable. It is. I I feel like we get away from that in society a little bit, but like it really is okay if it's hard. It's okay for it to be uncomfortable. It's okay to not get it right away. Like, these things are okay. Um, it's part of that work. It's part of that process that makes it so worth it. Um, oh man, wow, we got a really smart group in here. Somebody said, I wondered if the increased sugar consumption had something to do with stimulating dopamine and serotonin. I don't know the answer to that. Educated guess would be probably, but I don't have MD behind my name. Um, so, you know, but there have been studies that show that sugar, and when I say sugar, I mean white processed sugar, activates the same parts of our brain that cocaine does. So there's definitely something to be said for that. Um, yeah, all right. Well, if there's no other questions, I would just like to say thank you to everybody who came today. Thank you to those who are going to be watching this later. Um, Alwyn Dawn, on Twitter and Instagram. On Facebook, it's Alwyn Dawn Official. Long story, don't ask. But if you want to connect with me, those are the best ways. Yeah, and best of luck to everybody out there. Like, have patience with yourself and just breathe.